Hey there, welcome back. Find a good spot, pull up the covers, and just let everything from the day dissolve. There's nothing you need to do right now, nothing you need to think about except for the sound of my voice. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time again, as we always do. We're going to float over to England a few hundred years ago, to a world of castles and kings and very, very strange jobs. Most of us have had an awkward job at some point. That summer you spent dressing up as a giant hot dog, or that time you had to file paperwork in a dusty basement for 8 hours a day. But it's comforting to know that no matter how weird your job was, history has always done it weirder. And when it comes to weird jobs, the royal court was the undisputed champion. There were people hired to be the royal rat catcher or the keeper of the royal moles. But tonight, we're not just looking for a weird job. We're looking for the king of them all. A position so bizarre, so intimate, and so awkward that it's almost hard to believe it was real. And yet, for the better part of 200 years, it was one of the most powerful and sought-after jobs in the entire kingdom. We're going to talk about the man who knew the king better than anyone, better than his wife, better than his advisors, better than his own mother. We're going to talk about the groom of the king's close stool. And yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. So take a deep breath and let's travel back to the strange, quiet world of the Tudor court. Before we arrive in the era of grand palaces and Henry VIII, we need to understand where this unique position came from. Power in the medieval world wasn't just about armies and laws. It was about proximity. It was about access. The king was the center of the universe, and the closer you were to him physically, the more important you were. This idea is sometimes called body politics. The king's body was not his own. It was a symbol of the state. And so every act, from getting dressed to eating a meal to relieving himself, was a ceremony in miniature. The people who were allowed to participate in these ceremonies were, by definition, the elite. The court was structured in rings of access, like ripples in a pond. The outer ring was the public court, the Great Hall, filled with hundreds of nobles, petitioners, and hangers-on, all hoping for a glance from the monarch. Then you had the King's Chamber, a more private area for meetings, important meals, and audiences. This was run by a great nobleman called the Lord Chamberlain, but inside that was the most private space of all, the Privy Chamber. Privy, just meaning private. This was the king's personal apartment, his bedroom, his dressing room, his study, and yes, his bathroom. Access to this space was the ultimate privilege. And in the Middle Ages, the king's bathroom wasn't quite what we'd picture. It was a small room, sometimes called a garderobe, which was essentially a stone closet built into the thick castle walls. It had a hole in a stone or wooden bench that led down a chute to the moat or a cesspit below. Charming. The device the king used when he wasn't in a castle was the close stool picture, a fancy wooden box, often upholstered with velvet and silk, with a lid on top and a porcelain or pewter bowl inside. It was, for all intents and purposes, a portable toilet, a throne of a different sort. And the management of this object and the room it was in was a job, a humble job at first. Someone had to carry the stool, empty and clean the bowl, supply water, cloths, and herbs to disguise the smell. This person was a servant, a valet, a yeoman, or groom, the groom of the stool. In these early days, it was a job of his service, not a job of power. The man who held the job was just a guy, making sure the king was comfortable. He was a nobody, but a nobody who saw the king at his most vulnerable. But then a new family came to the throne, the Tudors, and they had a very different idea about privacy and power and who you could trust. The first Tudor king, Henry VII, came to the throne in 1485 after the Battle of Bosworth Field. He had spent most of his young life in exile, a political pawn with a very flimsy claim to the throne. When he finally won the crown, he was famously and justifiably paranoid. He was surrounded by powerful old noble families who had spent the last few decades butchering each other in the Wars of the Roses. He didn't trust any of them. He saw plots in every shadow. His reign was plagued by pretenders, impostors like Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be a lost royal prince, and Perkin Warbeck, who for years convinced half of Europe he was the true King of England. Because of this deep-seated paranoia, Henry VII retreated. He didn't want the great lords of the realm hanging around him, listening at doors, gauging his moods. So he made the Privy Chamber his real center of government. It was here, in his private rooms, that he did his real work. He meticulously went over the kingdom's accounts, stored his vast reserves of cash, and made his most critical decisions. Suddenly, the only people who saw him, who spoke to him on a daily basis, were his most intimate servants. The men who dressed him, who served his private meals, and the man who attended to him on his close stool. Henry VII turned a simple valet position into an official office. The groom of the king's close stool was no longer just a cleaner. He was a personal attendant chosen by the king himself for his loyalty and discretion. He was the first person the king saw in the morning and the last person he saw at night. He was a gatekeeper. If you wanted to pass a secret message to the king or ask for a favor without the whole court knowing, you went through the groom. The role started to change. It started to become something more. It wasn't a path to greatness yet, but the seeds were planted. The groom of the stool was now a position of incredible trust. And in a royal court, trust was the most valuable currency of all. And then came Henry VIII, and everything changed. When we picture Henry VIII, we picture a giant of a man, loud, extravagant, full of energy. In his youth, he was the superstar of Christendom, handsome, athletic, a musician, a scholar. His court was a spectacle of wealth and power, and his father's quiet, miserly style was not for him. But he did inherit one thing: an appreciation for the Privy Chamber. It was his sanctuary, his escape, his man cave. And the men who served him there were not just servants, they were his friends, his minions, as they were called. A group of young, high-born, handsome men who hunted with him, jousted with him, played tennis with him, wrote songs with him, gambled with him, and stayed up late drinking with him. And the most senior of them all, the captain of this band of brothers, was the groom of the stool. Under Henry VIII, the job exploded in status. The groom was almost always a high-born gentleman, and he was without question the king's closest friend. The duties expanded far beyond just the bathroom. The groom of the stool was now in charge of the entire privy purse, the king's personal finances. He handled all of Henry's private cash flow. Henry was a notorious gambler, and it was the groom who would have thousands of pounds on hand to pay his debts or to collect his winnings. If the king wanted to give a secret gift to a new mistress, it was the groom who arranged it. This wasn't pocket money. It was a vast fortune that flowed through the groom's hands with very little oversight. He was effectively the king's personal banker, chief of staff, and private secretary rolled into one. He was also in charge of the king's dry stamp, a perfect copy of the king's signature that could be stamped onto documents, which were then inked over. The groom controlled the king's very identity on paper. The first man to truly embody this new level of power was Sir William Compton. Compton was a childhood friend of Henry's, raised with him from a young age. He wasn't from a grand noble family, but he was handsome, charming, a brilliant jouster, and utterly devoted to the king. When Henry took the throne in 1509, he immediately made Compton his groom of the stool. For the next decade and a half, Compton was arguably the second most powerful man in England. While the great Cardinal Wolsey handled the grand politics of the state in public, Compton handled the king in private. He controlled who got to see Henry, what letters he read, what news he heard. He knew everything. This intimacy gave Compton enormous influence. Courtiers who wanted a promotion or a piece of land or a favorable judgment in a legal case wouldn't bother trying to get a formal audience with the king. They would go to William Compton. They would offer him a gift, a bribe really, and Compton would find the right moment, perhaps while helping the king get ready for bed, to whisper their request in Henry's ear. And more often than not, the king, relaxed and in the company of his best friend, would agree. Compton became incredibly wealthy. He acquired vast estates all over England, granted to him by his grateful friend, the king. He wasn't just the king's servant. He was his shadow, his other self. But of course, being that close to a man like Henry VIII was like sleeping next to a volcano. It was warm and exciting, until it wasn't. Compton's power was entirely dependent on the king's personal affection, and that affection could be fickle. Compton had to navigate the treacherous waters of the king's ego and temper. He even got deeply involved in the king's love life, which was always a dangerous game. At one point, he was rumored to be having an affair with one of the king's mistresses, Anne Stafford. When her brother, the powerful Duke of Buckingham, found out, he made a furious scene at court. Henry was enraged, not necessarily at the affair, but at the public scandal and the challenge to his authority. For a moment, it looked like Compton might be disgraced. But his bond with Henry was too strong. Compton was forced into a humiliating vow that he would not approach Anne Stafford again, but he kept his job. The Duke of Buckingham, however, had made a powerful enemy in the king. A few years later, he was accused of treason on the flimsiest of charges and executed. It was a stark lesson for everyone at court. The groom of the stool was protected. His enemies were not. Compton eventually died in 1528, not at the executioner's block, but from the sweating sickness, a terrifyingly swift disease. His death was a genuine blow to Henry. He had lost not just a servant, but a brother. But the position he had built up remained, and the next man to hold it would learn an even harder lesson about the dangers of the king's friendship. His name was Sir Henry Norris. Like Compton, Norris was a gentleman of the court and a close friend of the king. He was
appointed Groom of the Stool after Compton's death and held the position during one of the most turbulent periods in English history. Henry VIII's great break with the Church of Rome and his obsessive quest to marry Anne Boleyn. Throughout this entire saga, Norris was right there in the Privy Chamber, listening to the king's frustrations with the Pope, his infatuation with Anne, and his anger at his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. He was the keeper of the king's deepest secrets during a time of national crisis. He helped dress the king on the morning of his secret wedding to Anne. He managed the finances for her lavish coronation. He was at the absolute heart of power. Norris was known as a gentle, popular man, respected at court. He was a calming presence for the notoriously hot-tempered king. For years, he was a fixed star in the royal firmament. But then, the king's obsession with Anne Boleyn soured. She had failed to give him the one thing he craved, a son, and his eye had begun to wander to a new face at court, a quiet, pale young woman named Jane Seymour. And when Henry VIII wanted something, he was not a man to be trifled with. He didn't just want a divorce from Anne. He wanted her gone, completely. What happened next was a brutal and terrifying demonstration of royal power. In 1536, a plot was hatched by the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, to get rid of the queen. They needed a reason, and the charge they settled on was adultery, which for a queen was also high treason. But they needed to name her supposed lovers, and in a stroke of chilling political calculation, they chose a group of men from the king's own Privy Chamber. His closest friends, his jousting companions, and the most prominent among them was the Groom of the Stool, Henry Norris. The accusation was almost certainly baseless. There was no real evidence, just rumors and whispers twisted into confessions under torture by a terrified musician. Norris was a respected family man, and the idea that he would risk everything to have an affair with the queen was ludicrous. But it didn't matter. The king wanted Anne gone, and Cromwell needed scapegoats. Norris was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The king, his supposed best friend, even sent a message to him in his cell, offering him a full pardon if he would just confess. Surely Norris must have thought this was all a terrible misunderstanding. The king was just testing his loyalty. He was his groom. He had shared 1,000 private moments with him. But Norris refused to confess to a crime he didn't commit. He maintained his innocence and the queen's innocence to the very end. It was a brave act of loyalty in a court consumed by fear, but it was pointless. He was found guilty in a show trial and sentenced to death. On the morning of his execution, he stood on the scaffold and gave a carefully worded speech, as was the custom, but he never admitted to the specific crime of adultery. He was beheaded with an axe. A few days later, Queen Anne Boleyn met the same fate. The execution of Henry Norris sent a shockwave through the court. It was a terrifying message. No one was safe. Not even the king's most intimate friend. The man who had guarded his secrets, who had seen him at his most human, was ultimately just a pawn in the king's ruthless game.
After the fall of Norris, you'd think men would be wary of the job, but the lure of power was too strong. The position was filled by others, but it was Henry's last groom of the stool who would play one final crucial role in the reign. His name was Sir Anthony Denny. Denny was more of a scholar than a jouster, a member of a reformist, Protestant-leaning circle at court. He became groom in the 1540s, when Henry was an old man. The athletic, handsome king was gone, replaced by a morbidly obese, paranoid, and often furious invalid, his legs covered in stinking, weeping ulcers. Denny's job was not to be a fun-loving friend, but a nursemaid and a manager to a dying tyrant. It was Denny who had to dress the king's enormous body, who had to help him move, who had to endure his rages. And it was Denny who controlled the dry stamp. In Henry's final months, as he lay dying, he was often too weak to sign documents himself. All state papers were brought to Denny, who would, with the king's permission, apply the royal signature. This gave him immense power. He and his allies could effectively control the entire government, deciding which documents the king signed. In the king's final days, it was Denny who had the courage to tell the terrifying monarch that his end was near. And it was Denny who, after the king's death, held the king's will. He and his faction kept the king's death a secret for 3 days while they consolidated their power, using the dry stamp one last time to make favorable amendments to the king's will, granting themselves more land and power in the new council that would rule for Henry's young son. It was the ultimate act of Privy Chamber power, a quiet, paper-based coup, executed by the man who held the king's signature. When Henry VIII finally died, his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, took the throne. A boy king changes the dynamic of a court. The intimacy of the Privy Chamber was different. The role of groom of the stool continued, held by older men who were more like guardians or tutors. The power was still there, but the boisterous, dangerous friendship of Henry's reign was gone. Then, after Edward's short reign, his sister Mary I became queen, and a female monarch presented a problem for a job with such a distinctly masculine name and function. You couldn't, of course, have a groom of the queen's close stool. The intimacy of the role required a woman. So, under Queen Mary and later her sister, Queen Elizabeth I, the equivalent position was the First Lady of the Bedchamber. The principles were exactly the same. This was the woman who had the most private access to the Queen. She controlled the Privy Chamber, helped the Queen dress, and acted as her most trusted confidant. Under Elizabeth III, who reigned for over 40 years, this role was incredibly important. Elizabeth, like her grandfather Henry VII, was cautious and often secretive. She kept her own counsel and trusted very few people completely. Her First Lady of the Bedchamber for many years was a woman named Cat Ashley, who had been her governess since she was a little girl. Cat was more than a servant. She was a surrogate mother, a friend, a sister. She saw Elizabeth through plots, imprisonments, and the constant pressure to marry. She knew all of Elizabeth's secrets. She was fiercely loyal, and Elizabeth rewarded that loyalty with complete trust. After Cat's death, the role was often shared, but the principle remained.
To be a woman of the Queen's bedchamber was to be at the very center of power, a gatekeeper to the monarch, just as Compton and Norris had been for her father. But then Elizabeth I died without an heir, and the throne passed to her cousin, the King of Scotland, who became James I of England. The Stuart dynasty had arrived, and with a king back on the throne, the old masculine titles of the court came roaring back, and none came back with more prestige than the Groom of the Stool. James I was a very different character from the Tudors. He was an intellectual, but he also had an intense need for close male friendships. He famously had a series of male favorites throughout his reign, showering them with titles, wealth, and affection. The court buzzed with gossip about the nature of these friendships, and the natural position for these favorites was in the king's bedchamber. The Groom of the Stool under James was, once again, the king's closest companion. He was almost always a handsome, charming young man who captured the king's eye, like Robert Carr or, most famously, George Villiers, who James elevated from a minor gentleman to the all-powerful Duke of Buckingham. The role was still about managing the king's private life, but it took on a new layer of intense, personal emotion. It was less about being the king's banker and more about being the king's soulmate. This tradition continued with his son, Charles I, but Charles was a much more formal and reserved man than his father. He believed deeply in the divine right of kings and maintained a majestic distance from most of his subjects. For him, the Groom of the Stool was not so much a personal fiend as a ceremonial necessity. The position was elevated to a new level of aristocratic prestige. It could now only be held by a very senior nobleman from an ancient and respected family. The Groom of the Stool was no longer just a powerful courtier. He was one of the great officers of state. The awkward, humble origins of the job were now almost completely forgotten, buried under layers of titles and ceremony. He was still in charge of the king's private rooms, but the actual physical duties were likely delegated to lesser servants. The groom himself was far too grand to be emptying a chamber pot. He was an administrator, a manager, a figure of immense dignity. Then came the English Civil War, and King Charles I lost his head. The monarchy was abolished. For a decade, there were no kings and no grooms. But in 1660, the monarchy was restored, and the executed king's son came back from exile to become Charles II. The Restoration Court was famous for its parties, its wit, and its pleasure-seeking atmosphere. And at the heart of it all was the king's bedchamber. Charles II, like his grandfather James I, prized his private circle of friends. The position of Groom of the Stool was revived and given to his most loyal companions, men who had stood by him during his long years in exile. By this point, the title was almost entirely symbolic. It was a sign of ultimate royal favor. The man who held it was a great lord, a member of the government, a man of immense public standing. The job title was a historical curiosity, a funny little quirk of the English court. The actual, practical side of the job was a distant memory. The Groom of the Stool was now, essentially, the minister for the royal household.
And as the years went on, society's attitudes began to change. The Georgians, and later the Victorians, were a bit more prudish than their Tudor and Stuart ancestors. The raw, earthy reality of the original job title became a source of mild embarrassment. It just wasn't dignified. So in a very polite, very British way, the name of the office was quietly altered. The Groom of the Stool became the Groom of the Stole. A stole is a long ornamental scarf or robe worn by a monarch on ceremonial occasions. It sounded similar enough, but it neatly removed the uncomfortable bathroom connection. The evolution was complete. A job that began with a portable toilet had become a job associated with a piece of ceremonial clothing. The role continued under this new, sanitized name for a while. But the old system of courtier power was fading. The king was becoming more of a constitutional monarch, and the government was run by parliament and a prime minister, not by the king's friends in his private rooms. The power of the bedchamber was draining away. The final nail in the coffin came with Queen Victoria. She had her ladies of the bedchamber, of course, but the idea of a male courtier with a title like Groom of the Stole was seen as archaic and slightly ridiculous. The office was quietly phased out, its duties absorbed into other more modern-sounding positions, like the Master of the Robes. The Groom of the Stool, once the most powerful man in the kingdom, had finally, after centuries of service, been made redundant. And so, our story comes to a quiet end. It's a strange journey to think about, a journey that starts in a small, drafty room with a wooden box and ends in the grand ceremonies of state. It's the story of how the most mundane, most human, and most private of needs became a source of unimaginable power and influence. It shows us that in the world of kings and queens, power wasn't always found on the battlefield or in the council chamber. Sometimes it was found in the quiet moments, behind closed doors, in the company of the one person the king trusted enough to see him as he truly was, the groom of the king's closed stool, the man who held the secrets, managed the money, and occasionally lost his head. A truly awkward and truly remarkable piece of history. So now let the story fade. Let the details drift away like smoke. There's nothing else you need to know, nothing else to figure out. Just the feeling of stillness and the gentle pull of sleep. Let your mind be quiet. Let it be calm. Sweet dreams.